Hello and welcome to Vantage This Week, a show where we recap the highlights of the week gone by. The biggest stories this week were from West Asia. It started with Israel killing Hassan Nasrallah, the chief of Hezbollah. Nasrallah's killing set off a chain reaction and put West Asia further on edge. Then came the response. Iran retaliated by firing about 200 missiles at Israel, and some of them hit their targets, breaching Israel's Iron Dome. The attack has brought the two countries to the brink of an all-out war. If things do escalate, how are they placed? Who has the edge? We'll tell you how they stack up. And after all this talk of war, we also bring you a story of hope. We tell you how a long-extinct bird has been brought back. All this and more lined up. Let's get started.
Nasrallah was not just another terrorist, he was the terrorist.
We will face any possible attack, and we are ready.
Hassan Nasrallah was the most powerful man in Lebanon, with influence and followers beyond the country's borders. He literally had an army at his disposal and top-notch security. So how did Israel manage to kill him, and where does his death leave the Hezbollah? Let's tell you about the man first. Hassan Nasrallah was born in 1960 in eastern Beirut. It was an impoverished neighborhood. His father sold vegetables. He was the eldest of 9 children. Nasrallah was a Shia Muslim. The community had long been neglected in Lebanon. So at a young age, he was drawn to religion. In 1974, a group called Amal was formed, a Shia militia group called Amal. The very next year, Lebanon descended into a civil war and Nasrallah joined Amal. He was 15 years old. This was a brief stint in a militia. Soon he turned back to religious studies. He headed to the city of Najaf in central Iraq, where he met a cleric, a man who would impact his life deeply. This man was Ayatollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader of Iran. Nasrallah was close to Khomeini. He was inspired by him. So when he returned to Lebanon, he wanted to do what Khomeini was doing. Nasrallah joined Amal, the same Shia militia group again, but he kept wanting to do more. An opportunity came up in 1982. That's when Israel invaded Lebanon. More than 20,000 Lebanese were killed. When the assault ended, Beirut formed a unifying committee to heal the country. Amal became a part of this group. But Hassan Nasrallah and several others felt betrayed. They did not want to give in. For them, resistance was the only answer, so they left Amal. And in the same year, in 1982, they established the Hezbollah, or the Party of God. That's what the Hezbollah means. In the years that followed, Hezbollah grew rapidly. Nasrallah served as a fighter. He worked his way up the ranks. He often went to Iran to consult. And Hezbollah chose him to go to be sent to Iran because he was fluent in Persian. So Nasrallah was basically doing well for himself, but 1992 changed his life. Israel killed Abbas al-Musawi, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, and Hassan Nasrallah replaced him. He was only 32 years old and he became the Hezbollah chief at the age of 32. He transformed the Hezbollah. When he took charge, it was just a fringe group. Under him, it became a formidable force. In the year 2000, he drove Israel out of southern Lebanon. In 2006, he led the group to a deadly war with Israel. All of this gave Nasrallah a cult status, but he wasn't done. His next goal was to mainstream the Hezbollah. It was already a military force. He wanted to make it a political force too. In 2018, Hezbollah swept Lebanon's parliamentary elections. It became the biggest political party in the country. The Shia community loved him. But many hated him too. They accused him of fueling sectarianism and of being an Iranian stooge. But hated or loved, Nasrallah was a towering presence in Lebanon. He was everywhere, on posters, on TV, on the radio, but rarely seen in public. Very few people knew where he lived. He did not venture out, and his speeches were pre-recorded. They were broadcast from a secret location. And all of this gave him an aura of mystique and invincibility. So if he lived such a careful life, how did Israel manage to kill him? Well, the answer is deep intelligence. Reports suggest that Israel had a mole in the Hezbollah. Some say it was an Iranian. He kept an eye on Nasrallah. Apparently, Israel knew of his location for months. So why did they strike now? Because he was planning to move to a different location. Israel feared that he would disappear. They had a small window to act, and they decided to take him out. Most of the Israeli war cabinet approved of this. A few ministers opposed. The plan came together last Monday, and Prime Minister Netanyahu knew about it. But things actually fell into place only on Friday. Nasrallah was in his underground bunker. Israel confirmed the intelligence. Their defense minister and the IDF chief called Netanyahu. The Israeli prime minister was in New York at that time. He was just heading to deliver a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. When he was briefed about the intelligence, Netanyahu approved the strike. He then pitched for war at the UN. And less than an hour later, Israel struck Beirut. They hit the Hezbollah headquarters. Hassan Nasrallah was killed. It was a major win for Israel.
The elimination of Nasrallah is a necessary condition in achieving the objectives we have set, returning the residents of the north safely to their homes and changing the balance of power in the region for years.
The Hezbollah is decapitated. But here's the thing about terror groups. They're Hydra-headed. Killing the chief does not kill the group, and the Hezbollah has suffered a lot in the past 2 weeks. Pager blasts, airstrikes, and then the killing of their leader. They must be in shock, but they still have thousands of fighters. A vast majority of arsenal remains intact.
Hezbollah will continue with its goals and their presence in the field. The command system and the Mujahideen will continue following with your plan, with the same precision and the steps you have drawn up.
Hezbollah says it is ready for war, a war it may not be really prepared to fight. But at this point, it's not their decision to make. Israel is calling the shots. So West Asia is mourning Nasrallah's death. But here's the surprise. So are some people in India. We've seen rallies and protests in Kashmir and Lucknow. Not the small, spontaneous kind. These were big, well-organized processions. Hundreds of protesters/mourners joined in. They carried posters with Nasrallah's face. Take a look at this. To give you some background, Hezbollah is a Shia militant group, and Shias are a minority in Kashmir. They make up just 10% of the population, but they do have certain strongholds. For example, Budgam. It's located around 14 kilometers from Srinagar. And there, such sentiments have always existed. Even before the Gaza war, in the Shia quarters, you could see posters of Iran's Ayatollah or Qasem Soleimani or Hassan Nasrallah. There was a sense of Shia solidarity beyond borders. So this outpouring of grief is not surprising. But here's the problem. Supporting Gaza is fine. So is supporting the people of Lebanon. But supporting Hezbollah, that's more complicated. Legally, you can do it. No one can stop you. Hezbollah is not banned or a designated terror group in India. The government of India does not categorize the Hezbollah as terrorists. So you can support them if you want to, but I'm afraid this issue is not just legal. It's also a question of morals and national interest. Hassan Nasrallah had blood on his hands, the blood of innocent civilians. Just consider what happened in July this year. Hezbollah rockets hit a football field in the Golan Heights. They killed 12 innocent children. And it happened on Nasrallah's watch. Should anyone be celebrating such a man? You can question Israel's tactics, you can call out the violations of international law, but it doesn't change a simple fact. Hassan Nasrallah was an evil man. He may have fought for the Shia community, but he slaughtered innocents. And that's the moral problem with celebrating him. Now we come to national interest, because it's not just common people mourning him. Some Indian politicians are doing the same, like Mehbooba Mufti. She leads the People's Democratic Party in Kashmir, the PDP. Plus, she's a former chief minister. And Mufti cancelled her election campaign on Sunday. Do you know why? As a mark of respect for Nasrallah. Now, this was a strange decision to make because Kashmir will be voting tomorrow. It's the last phase of the assembly elections there, and yesterday was the last day of campaigning. Yet Mufti said, I will not hit the campaign trail, that too for Hassan Nasrallah, the same Nasrallah who supported Kashmiri self-determination, who undermined India's sovereignty over Kashmir. Should an Indian politician be celebrating such a man, that too a former chief minister? Surely not. And it's not just Mehbooba Mufti. A lot of candidates cancelled their campaign on Sunday, like Ruhullah Mehdi, a senior National Conference leader. The BJP has criticized these moves. They say the opposition is mourning a terrorist.
हसन नसरुल्लाह का मौत हो गया और आज कश्मीर में महबूबा मुफ्ती बोल रहा है कि हम चुनाव प्रसार नहीं करूंगा, हम दुखी हैं, किसलिए हसन नसरुल्लाह का मौत हो गया है। मैं महबूबा मुफ्ती, फारूक अब्दुल्ला, राहुल गांधी सबको पूछना चाहता हूं, जब हमारे कभी कोई जगह में हिंदू का मर्द होते हैं, आतंकवादी हिंदू जवानों को मारते हैं, तब आप लोग दुखी होते हैं कि नहीं होते हैं, ये कृपा करके हमें बताइए।
Some in Kashmir have been more careful, like former Chief Minister Omar Abdullah. He did not openly mourn or celebrate Nasrallah, but he asked the central government to put pressure on Israel to work towards ending the war. It's important to see all this in a broader context, because there is a campaign to globalize the Kashmir issue. Pakistan has been doing it, Turkey has been doing it. Recently, even Iran's supreme leader did it. He clubbed Kashmir with Gaza and Myanmar. In that context, certain red lines must be drawn. First, you cannot back leaders/terrorists who undermine India's sovereignty. That's what Hezbollah has done in the past. They questioned India's rights over Kashmir. And two, you cannot equate Kashmir with Gaza. That comparison is simply not on. But some Kashmiri leaders have hinted at it, like Mehbooba Mufti's daughter, Iltija Mufti. She's making her debut in this election, and she talked about atrocities on Muslims in Gaza and Kashmir as if they're comparable. Another example is senior National Conference leader Farooq Abdullah. He said Kashmir could turn into Gaza without India-Pakistan talks. Again, unacceptable. Such statements are coming from senior political leaders. They will influence the next generation. In fact, we're already seeing that. A lot of children were part of these rallies in Kashmir. Look at how they talked about Nasrallah's death.
आपने एक हिजबुल्लाह चीफ को मारा है, हर घर से हिजबुल्लाह निकलेगा। मैं लिबनानियंस को हौसला देना चाहूंगी कि वो बिल्कुल भी फिक्र ना करे, क्योंकि हम उनके साथ हैं। The Shia community उनके साथ है।
Do you think she understands West Asian politics or the nature of Hezbollah or what Hassan Nasrallah stood for? Chances are no, which is why Kashmir's politicians need to set better examples. There is a difference between Muslim solidarity and terror solidarity. I'm afraid this is leaning towards the latter. Israel's actions have not been legal, nor have they been responsible. But you cannot deny that they have been effective. Just consider the last 2 months. First, Israel killed the Hamas chief in Tehran. Then they killed the Hezbollah chief in Beirut. This is deep inside enemy territory. To attack with such precision is quite impressive. The question is, how did they do it? How did Israel do it? Thanks to a vast network of espionage. We're talking about multiple moving parts here. You've got cyber surveillance, you've got satellite images, you've got moles and double agents, all of them combined to pinpoint these targets. Let's look at each of these parts. The first is cyber espionage. Let me take you back to the year 2006. Israel and Hezbollah fought to a standstill. After 34 days of war, there was no clear victor. Israeli agencies felt humiliated and disappointed. So they quickly got to work. Their military has a special unit called Unit 8200. Its job is to collect enemy information. How? By intercepting cell phone messages or hacking mobile devices. After the 2006 war, this unit went into overdrive. They developed cutting-edge spying devices. Now, Hezbollah did suspect this, which is why they turned to pagers instead of mobile phones. They started using pagers, but Israel was one step ahead of them. They set up a shell company to supply these pagers to Hezbollah. After that, it was a question of sabotaging them, putting bombs in and shipping them. Chances are this was a cross-agency operation. The Mossad, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Unit 8200, all of them coordinated to complete it. And that's a feature of Israeli intelligence. Yes, there are multiple agencies, but the work is seamless. There is great coordination between them. Now, coming back to Lebanon, Israel's new focus gave them results. In 2008, they killed a top Hezbollah leader, Imad Mughniya. In 2020, they traced Iran's Qasem Soleimani to Beirut and then to Baghdad. And in July this year, they killed a Hezbollah commander, Fuad Shukur, all thanks to intelligence, which brings us to the second part of Israel's campaign, penetration, moles and double agents. Israel specializes in this sort of stuff. It's called human intelligence, or HUMINT. Using individuals in the enemy ranks to gather intelligence. That's what it is. Israel's been doing it for a while. In the 1960s, they had a spy in Syria, Eli Cohen. In the 1980s, they had one in Egypt, Ashraf Marwan. He tipped them off about the Yom Kippur War. But how does Israel manage this network? Creating a few moles is hard enough. Israel is said to have dozens, possibly hundreds of moles. Of course, their tactics are mostly classified, but intelligence leaks do give us an idea of how they do it. The honey trap is a usual tactic. Israel uses prostitutes to lure their targets, photographs them, and then uses the pictures as leverage. They also send agents abroad to seduce certain officials, like secretaries at embassies or even flight attendants. The idea is to keep tabs on who's flying in and out. And finally, they use money. Israel pays their moles and double agents quite well. Consider Ashraf Marwan, the spy in Egypt. He got between $50,000 and $100,000 for every tip-off, plus bonuses and gifts. A lot of these officials are sanctioned by the West. They live on meager government salaries, so such payments may sound lucrative. And look at the result. Israel's former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has made a revelation. He said that Iran has a special unit to tackle Israeli moles. Iran has a special unit to tackle Israeli moles, but guess what? The man heading that unit was himself an Israeli mole. So were 20 others with him. Now, Ahmadinejad may not be a reliable source. He has a history of wild statements, but he's not alone in saying this. A former foreign minister said the same thing in 2021. He said Israel had penetrated the upper echelons of Iran's regime. So to sum it up, Israel has done many things right. First, they have invested in intelligence. Israel allocates more than $2 billion to Mossad. They are well funded and well staffed. Secondly, they keep up with the times. They've used letter bombs, armed drones, exploding cell phones, exploding pagers, exploding motorcycles. You name it, they've done it. And third, patience. Intelligence is often a long-term game. Like I said, they began focusing on the Hezbollah way back in 2006. They've been tracking Nasrallah all along. But when did that investment come in handy? Nearly 18 years later. Israel has been willing to get its hands dirty to walk on the moral gray area, but things don't always go to plan. Like what happened on October 7, 2023, last year. Israel was blindsided by the Hamas attack, so intelligence is not always 100% accurate. Even when you get a tip-off, it can be wrong. Which brings us to the fourth thing that Israel does. They take risks. A lot of governments may think twice about such attacks. They may not act on such intel, but Israel does. Their leadership is willing to gamble. When it pays off, Israel looks invincible. And when it doesn't, their Western godfathers mop up after them. Every time Israel is attacked, you hear about the Iron Dome, the impenetrable shield. It's basically an air defense system. It ensures that projectiles do not hit Israeli targets. Instead, they're blown up in the sky. After the attack in April, everyone praised the Iron Dome. But this time, there is no such celebration. Some Iranian users are, in fact, mocking it. The videos make one thing clear. A lot of Iranian missiles broke through the air defenses. They managed to hit Israeli soil. They couldn't damage much, except for the reputation of the Iron Dome. But Iran showed that Israel's airspace can be breached. So how did they do it? What changed from the last time? Well, first, some background. Israel has a multi-layer air defense system. The first is obviously the Iron Dome. It shoots down rockets and small projectiles. Its range is 4 to 70 kilometers. That's the Iron Dome, the first layer. The second layer is called David's Sling. It can take out long-range rockets and cruise missiles. The range is up to 300 kilometers. And finally, you have the Arrow system, Arrow 1 and 2. These take out medium and long-range ballistic missiles and range up to 2,400 kilometers. In April, the Iron Dome did the heavy lifting, but this time it was the other systems. Iran says 90% of their projectiles hit the target. Israel says the majority was shot down. As expected, two different versions from two different sides, but pictures do not lie. There is clearly more physical damage this time around. The question is, how did it happen? Because of three main reasons. First, the intensity of the attack. The US government says this one was twice as big as the last one.
Certainly, this was a significant attack, probably about twice the size in terms of scope of what we saw earlier. But again, we're still assessing the outcomes of this.
It's simple logic. If you fire more missiles, you have more chances of hitting the target. That's what happened here. Some of the projectiles will sneak through. Which brings us to reason number two, the type of projectiles. In April, Iran fired mostly rockets and drones. These are not rapid flyers. They take their time to reach the target. The drones, for example, took 9 hours to fly from Iran to Israel, 9 hours. So the Iron Dome made short work of it. But this time, Iran stepped up. They fired 180 ballistic missiles. Now, these are lethal weapons. First, they're fired up to the Earth's atmosphere, sometimes even beyond the Earth's atmosphere. There, the payload separates from the rocket, and finally, it plunges towards its target, a bit like throwing a stone up in the air. Imagine the speed and the force created by such a fall. It makes intercepting them very difficult. Iran used two versions of these ballistic missiles, the medium-range Shahab-3 and the hypersonic Fateh-1. Hypersonic missiles can travel 5 times faster than sound. That's 6,100 kilometers per hour. Such missiles can reach Israel in 12 minutes. Do you see the difference? 9 hours in April, 12 minutes yesterday. So the speed made interception difficult. Finally, reason number three, the lack of warnings. In April, Iran informed the West days in advance. So they had time to prepare their defense. And this time, there were no warnings. The US and Israel had no clue until hours before the attack. So Iran had the element of surprise, which is why they had more success than the last time. As a strategy, it makes sense because air defense is expensive business. One Arrow missile that Israel uses. One Arrow missile costs $3.5 million. One David sling costs $1 million. But Iran's missiles are much cheaper, just $100,000 per shot. So the math works out in Iran's favor. It makes sense to exhaust Israel's defenses. But also remember, Israel has American financial support. Washington will help them restock. Nonetheless, yesterday's attack made a couple of things quite clear. One, Israel's defenses are not impenetrable. With the right weapons and tactics, you can hit them. And secondly, Iran has learned from its last attack, hence the decision to ditch the slow drones and use ballistic missiles. And they have more in stock. Iran is said to have 3,000 ballistic missiles. Only a fraction was unleashed on Israel yesterday. In many conflicts, it may be enough to establish deterrence, but here it may trigger more attacks. Now let's go back to the basics, the most elementary question. If the war escalates, who will win? Israel or Iran? Which country has the edge? Is it Israel with its high-tech weapons, or is it Iran with its raw numerical advantage? Let's go through all the data and see how they stack up. First, let's look at the overall numbers. Iran is home to almost 92 million people. Israel's population is about a tenth of that at 9.4 million. So you can imagine their military personnel figures reflect this. Iran has 610,000 active troops, 610,000, 350,000 reserve fighters and 220,000 paramilitary personnel. Altogether, that's 1.18 million people in the Iranian army. What about Israel? Well, they have 170,000 active duty personnel, 465,000 reservists and 35,000 paramilitary troops, coming to a total of 670,000. That's a little more than half of Iran's military figures. So Israel seems outmanned. Now, we can argue that the numbers do not matter because everyone in Israel is trained to fight. They're all trained fighters. This country has mandatory military service. Almost all Israelis serve in the armed forces for 2.5 to 3 years. Well, here's the thing. Iran has that too, mandatory military service. But in Iran, it's just for the men. But think about the huge population difference between Iran and Israel. It means that Iran has a lot more people who know how to fight or who've been trained on how to fight. So an all-out war would probably favor Iran in terms of sheer manpower. It's the same when we look at tank figures, armored vehicle numbers, towed artillery, mobile rocket projectors. On the ground, it's Iran that comes out on top. And it's the same situation at sea. Israel doesn't really have a noteworthy navy. Look at the numbers. No frigates, no destroyers, no aircraft carriers, and 5 submarines compared to Iran's 19. Iran's navy isn't great either, but it beats Israel in most parameters. So by the looks of it, Iran has the edge on the ground and the sea. However, those figures probably won't matter much, because Tehran won't be launching a naval blockade and a standard land war is not really an option for either side. Let's look at the map of West Asia. You have Israel on one side and the Mediterranean coast. Then you have several countries in between, and then comes Iran. Israel is not marching through Jordan and Iraq to invade Iran. That is impractical. And if Iran tries to do this, Israel can just pick the troops off from above. No Iranian convoy or tank column is going to reach Israel. So face-to-face fighting probably won't happen. Therefore, manpower doesn't really matter much. Ground and sea superiority won't help either. The real battle here is in the air. And that is where Israel shines. Let's compare. Fighter jets, Israel 241, Iran 186. Dedicated attack craft, Israel 39, Iran 23. Attack helicopters, Israel 48, Iran 13. You get the picture. Israel has far greater numbers in the air, and that's not even the deciding factor. It's the quality of the Israeli Air Force that really gives it superiority. Iran is flying antiques. Fighter jets from the 60s and the 70s. It acquired these planes before the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So Iran has a squadron of old American F-4s and 5s. One squadron of the Russian Su-24s and some other jets here and there. That's what Iran has. On the other side, you have Israel with state-of-the-art F-15s, F-16s, and of course, F-35 stealth fighters. Tehran has no answer to this. A squadron of F-4s from 1960 won't do much to a modern F-35, not unless they get very lucky. So Israel is almost unchallenged in the skies. If a full-scale war breaks out, Israel will depend on this aerial superiority, and it will try and lay waste to Iran, like with Gaza and now Lebanon. But it won't be the same. It won't be as easy, because Tehran is not without its own pointy ends. Iran knows that it can compete in the skies. It cannot compete in the skies, not in the conventional dogfights or aerial raids. And it has known this for years, which is why it came up with a different plan for the air. Instead of jets and helicopters, Iran relies on missiles and drones. The pride of the pack is the Shahed 136, Iran's best-known kamikaze drone. They're relatively cheap to make, they're easy to use, and they can swarm the enemy. Israel has dozens of fighter jets. Iran has hundreds, if not thousands, of drones. When it all comes to aerial bombardment, it will be quality versus quantity. Will Israel be able to take down Iranian drones every day? Not to mention missiles like the Fateh 1 and 2, Iran's indigenous hypersonic missiles. To win an aerial war, Iran needs to shoot down about 240 jets. Israel, however, needs to shoot down dozens of projectiles every single day. It's a tough fight to call. Or it would be if this was a purely military contest, but it's not. With Israel versus Iran, other factors also come into play, like economics. Israel is one of the richest countries in West Asia. Iran has been suffering under sanctions for years. It has 10 times Israel's population, but a lower GDP. And that is sustained due to oil and weapon exports. What happens if Israel blows up Iranian oil refineries or drone factories? What happens to Iran's economy? To the ordinary people of Iran? It's not a situation that Tehran can really afford, especially in the event of a war. So the economy is Israel's trump card. In fact, Israel has an even bigger advantage, something that Iran cannot compete with at all. Israel has the United States. There are normal allies. Iran has those. It is friendly with Russia and China, not bad to have as support. But they won't back Iran the way the Americans will back Israel. If Israel comes under attack, the US will step in. No matter who is right or wrong, no matter who is president of America, if Israel is on the back foot, America will come in all guns blazing, and that may be the deciding factor in this war. So most Arab states seem to be neutral. Why do you suppose that is? Well, no one likes war, especially if you're focused on the economy, but there may be another reason. You see, all the Arab nations in the Gulf have something in common. They've all partnered up with the US for security. And all the petrodollars, no doubt. These partnerships have allowed the US to build bases all over the place and station thousands of troops in the region. As we speak, the Americans have more than 43,000 boots on the ground, and more soldiers are on the way. Where are they headed? Well, here's a map of the region. And these are the American military sites in the area. There are a lot, both permanent bases and makeshift sites. The smaller sites are all over the place, even in Arab nations which are sympathetic to Iran. Countries like Iraq and Syria. The Americans have bases there too. Then there are bases in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Oman. As you can see, the US has troops practically everywhere. Troops, jets, drones, ships, you name it. It seems every Arab country has made some deal or the other with the Americans. The largest concentration of bases is in Kuwait. There are 5 bases there, and about 13,500 permanently deployed troops, mostly at Camp Arif Jan and the Ali Al Salam Air Base. Those were the numbers from 2021, before the latest conflict, so expect additional deployments right now. Now, Kuwait is at Iran's doorstep. That is why it makes sense for the Americans to boost their presence there. You also have other major US bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. Again, these are long-term installations, making them ideal for an additional influx of troops. Another major base is in Djibouti in Africa, at the tip of the Red Sea, right across from Yemen, which is where the Iran-backed Houthi group is based, in Yemen. We told you that the Houthis plan to step up their attacks on global shipping. Well, the US is prepared. Not just with that base in Djibouti, but also additional naval deployments. The US already had ships in the Red Sea to deter the Houthis. Now it has sent 4 more, 4 guided missile destroyers to augment its presence. The Americans also have ships in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. This is near Israel's coast, which means near both Gaza and Lebanon. You may have heard the term gunboat diplomacy. It's when countries send both diplomats and warships to another nation, just in case negotiations fail. The US was famous for this back in the day, and it seems old habits die hard. The US currently has 3 guided missile destroyers and 1 amphibious assault ship in the Mediterranean, and they're sending one of their aircraft carriers as well. The USS Harry S. Truman is on its way to West Asia. It is traveling with a strike group. This means more destroyers, more carriers, and more frigates, all making their way to a volatile region. The Americans already have 1 aircraft carrier in the region. It's called the USS Abraham Lincoln. It's said to be operating in the Gulf of Oman, breathing down Iran's neck. So the second carrier will probably be deployed in another region. As you can see from the map, America has all of West Asia covered to make sure that nothing happens to Israel. But that's just the US. What about the rest? Well, no one compares to the Americans, but the UK is also ramping up its presence. Britain has bases in Cyprus, and it has deployed 700 additional troops there, joining the 500 they had deployed earlier this summer. The UK also has ships patrolling the eastern Mediterranean to fight the Houthis and to help with evacuations if it comes to that. Now, amid all of this, India has sent ships to the region as well, but for a very different reason. 3 Indian ships have docked at the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas: the INS Tir, INS Shardul, and ICGS Veera. These ships are in Iran for training exercises. The Indian ships arrived in Iran on Tuesday, hours after Iran fired missiles at Israel. Talk about awkward timing, but the Indian ships are there now, and they will go ahead with a scheduled training exercise, thus adding to the deployments in the region. So that's how things stand right now. As you can see, West Asia is a powder keg. The next strong move can set it off. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The British Empire has witnessed yet another sunset, this time in the Chagos Islands. The UK is returning the islands to Mauritius. Chagos is a cluster of strategically important islands in the Indian Ocean. The largest among them is Diego Garcia. It became a military base for the UK and the US when Mauritius, a former British colony, was forced to give up the islands in exchange for their independence in 1968. Over the past few years, there has been mounting pressure on the UK to surrender from several nations, including India. In fact, sources say that India played a quiet but important role. And after more than half a century, the UK is finally handing over the sovereignty of these islands. Why does it matter? And what does the deal say? Here's a report.
The Chagos Islands. It's an archipelago of more than 60 islands in the Indian Ocean. This is a remote but strategically important cluster. After all, this was Britain's last African colony. We say was because after more than a century, the UK has finally agreed to hand over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. This is a historic move. It comes after decades of mounting anger and years of fractious negotiations. Here is a quick flashback. Mauritius was a former British colony. It was illegally forced to give the Chagos Islands away in return for its own independence in 1968, and Chagos became the so-called British Indian Ocean Territory. Back then, the British negotiated a secret deal with the US. They agreed to lease Diego Garcia, the largest atoll of Chagos, which became a US-UK military base. The UK evicted about 1,500 residents. They were sent to Mauritius and the Seychelles. Britain later apologized for this move and promised to hand the islands to Mauritius when they were no longer needed for strategic use. But that day never came. The UK insisted that Mauritius had no legitimate claim to the islands. Standard colonial gaslighting. But in recent years, the UK has faced diplomatic isolation over their claim. Various UN bodies, including the top court and General Assembly, have sided with Mauritius, demanding that the UK surrender. Several nations, including India, have played their part as well. According to sources, India has played a quiet but important role. So finally, they have. Which brings us back to the deal. What does it say? First, it secures the future of Diego Garcia. This island has been central to the territory dispute. Even today, it's a key military base for the UK and the US. It houses Navy ships and long-range bomber aircraft. So the deal guarantees the operation of the base for the next 99 years. And second, it secures the future of the archipelago's people. Islanders who were displaced in the past 5 decades now have the right of return. India has called the outcome a win for all sides, as per sources. US President Joe Biden welcomed the deal. He says that it was a clear demonstration that through diplomacy and partnership, countries can overcome long-standing historical challenges to reach peaceful and mutually beneficial outcomes. But not everyone is happy. The UK's Conservative leaders have called this a weak and appalling move. No surprises there. But about half a century after the UK gave up control of most of its vast global empire, it has finally agreed to hand over the Chagos Islands. But this is one of many, including the Cayman Islands, Falkland Islands, and Gibraltar. Now, the other British overseas territories can only wait for the sun to set on the empire on their shore.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Russia is hiking its defense spending in 2025. It will be up by 25%, which means defense spending will account for over 6% of their GDP. This is the highest since the Cold War. But what explains this mammoth spending? Well, it could be the Russian economy. It looks resilient, but it is under pressure. Right now, the only thing sustaining the Russian economy is the defense spending. It looks good in the short term, but in the long term, it could be a problem. In fact, economists believe that Moscow could be in recession if it chooses to end the war. Our next report tells you why.
За Россию! За победу! Ура!
It's day 949 of the Ukraine war. The front lines remain unchanged. Fighting continues. Russian troops are making advances in the east. The Kiev army remains stuck in Kursk. It looks like the war isn't coming to an end anytime soon. But Ukraine has a different view. President Zelensky believes peace is closer than the world thinks. However, it seems Russia doesn't share the same viewpoint. It's preparing for a long war, and you can see it in its draft budget for the next year. Moscow is hiking its defense spending by 25% for 2025. It will rise to 13.5 trillion rubles, around $145 billion. Defense spending will now make up for 32% of the 2025 budget. It will account for 6.3% of the GDP. This will be the highest level since the Cold War. Not just that, Russia is also focusing on national security. That's separate from national defense. It will spend 3.5 trillion rubles in 2025, which is about $38 billion. So put together, Moscow will spend 17 trillion rubles on just defense and security. That's a lot of money, and Russia needs to raise it from somewhere. So they have cut down spending in other sectors. Take social spending, for example. It's decreasing by 16% in the 2025 budget. Now, what Russia is doing is called military Keynesianism. It's spending money on the military to boost the economy. This is how it works. The government spends a lot on defense. These investments create more jobs. The money circulates through the economy. Overall demand goes up, and economic growth gets a temporary boost. We can see that with Russia, despite sanctions, the economy remains resilient. This year, it will rise by over 3%. But here's the problem with this strategy. In the long run, it's not sustainable. That's because military spending cannot boost long-term productivity. The society can't benefit from it. In fact, it only diverts resources away from essential services. And that's already happening in Russia. So why then is Moscow doing it? It's because military spending is the only thing propping up the economy. Right now, it may look resilient, but there are some warning signs. The first is inflation. Consumer prices rose by 9% this year compared to last year. In September, the Bank of Russia hiked interest rates. They are up to 19%. That's the highest since the Ukraine war began. There are currency problems too. Moscow is sanctioned by the West, and that means a limited access to dollars. Its oil revenue is also plunging. All of this doesn't paint a very good picture. In fact, economists believe the Ukraine war is the only thing preventing Russia from plunging into recession, which explains the mammoth defense spending this time. But can Russia sustain this? Moscow's budget deficit is going up. This year, it will be 1.7% of GDP. That's up from the projected figure of 1.1%. That means the government is spending more money than it's earning. While Russia believes it can live through anything, the reality begs to differ.
Climbing Mount Everest has always been a tough task, but now it's only getting tougher because the Everest is getting taller. We're not kidding. Mount Everest is a geological marvel. This Himalayan peak is more than 29,000 feet tall, making it the world's tallest mountain. But according to a new study, it is only getting taller by about the width of a strand of spaghetti each year. Why? Because 89,000 years ago, one river ate another. Confused? Here's our report.
This is Mount Everest, a Himalayan peak, a geological marvel, and a potentially lethal climbing challenge. But guess what? With each passing year, this challenge is only getting tougher. You already know that the Everest is staggeringly tall. At 29,032 feet, it's about 800 feet taller than other Himalayan peaks like K2, Kanchenjunga and Lhotse. Everest is the world's tallest mountain, and it's getting taller. It grows by several millimeters each year. That's about the width of a strand of spaghetti. This may not sound like much, but over the last 89,000 years, the mountain has risen by up to 164 feet, and it continues to grow. Why? Because of what happened 89,000 years ago. But to understand that, let's go back further in history, to about 50 million years ago when the Everest was formed. There was a giant clash among the tectonic plates. The tectonic plate India rests on crashed into the Eurasian plate and then started descending below it. So one plate was slightly on top of the other, and the crust crumbled. This created the Himalayas. Now, the Earth's crust may seem rigid, but it's not. So when something this massive, like a mountain range, weighs down the crust, it goes downward. And what's below the crust? The mantle. This is buoyant, so it pushes the crust upward. Think of it this way. The Himalayas are standing on a massive bouncy castle, which pushes them up and down. This happens gradually. But 89,000 years ago, something fascinating happened. the Arun River, which lies east of Everest, changed its course. It bumped into a river flowing north of the Everest and stole its water. Combined, the two rivers were a water giant, and they grew more erosive. They were washing away billions of tons of sediments. This wreaked havoc in the bouncy house below the Everest. It changed the topography and pushed the mountain upwards. We are still seeing the effects of this, and scientists say the Everest's growth spurt will continue for millions of years, then it will gradually stop. Because the Himalayas rise and fall, just like all mountain ranges, thanks to the so-called bouncy house, which comes with magical height-increasing perks.
Now, let me say what we've all been thinking. It's been a heavy day with all the wars and geopolitical turmoil, and it's only Wednesday. So let's end on a lighter note. Our last story tonight is about bald ibis. These are migratory birds known for their bold red head and long curved beak. 300 years ago, they went extinct in Central Europe. But thanks to breeding efforts, they have come back from extinction. But because they were gone for centuries, they have forgotten how to migrate. So scientists are teaching them how to do it by flying along with them and showing them the way and shouting words of encouragement. Here's a report.
300 years. That's how long Central Europe did not see a bald ibis for. Bald ibis or waldrops are known for their bald red head and long curved beak. They were once common across North Africa and much of Europe, but they were considered a delicacy, so they were widely hunted and their habitats were destroyed due to rampant deforestation. So their numbers dropped and they went extinct in Central Europe. But scientists increased efforts to boost their populations, and over the past 2 decades, they've been successful. Now their numbers are close to 800, and the bald ibis have come back from extinction in Central Europe. But there's a catch. Bald ibis are migratory birds, but they no longer know how to migrate. They don't know where to go or which course to take because they didn't receive guidance from their wild ancestors. Migratory birds rely on learned information that's passed down to them. The new generation of wild ibis doesn't have that privilege, and this is a cause for concern. Without the knowledge of direction, the bald ibis will not know where to fly for winter. They still have the natural urge to migrate, so they try to fly. But over the past few years, when the birds did try to migrate on their own, instead of reaching suitable wintering grounds, they flew in different directions and died. So scientists are stepping in. They are acting as the birds' foster parents. Have you watched the 1996 movie Fly Away Home? In the movie, the main character flies a plane to show orphaned geese their migratory path. Now scientists are doing something similar in real life. Researchers aboard a small plane are teaching birds how to migrate, how to follow their long-forgotten migration routes. And a battalion of 36 endangered birds are diligently following the aircraft from Austria to Spain. Scientists are using parenting techniques. They are building a bond with the birds so that the bald ibis trusts them. They are waving at the birds and shouting encouragement at them as they fly. Now, that's some good parenting. The project is still underway. The trip could take 50 days to complete. This is the first such attempt to reintroduce migratory species, and scientists hope that it's successful. Because with climate change, the warming world is changing how birds migrate. For migration, timing is key. So with spring shifting earlier and blooms popping out of schedule, hundreds of bird species have had to change not only their own timing, but also their paths. And in many cases, this proves deadly. While a few scientists cannot stop climate change, maybe they can teach the birds how to migrate differently.
So all this news of escalation and attacks, most of the world is quite depressed by it. They're concerned about the possible fallout. Not social media, though. It's a whole different world out there. One that is joking about World War III. Granted, it is disturbing, but it's also a commentary on the times we live in. Violence and deaths do not shake people anymore. They've become used to hearing about it. Just look at the shift Talk of world wars used to trigger shortages and food rationing. But now it is triggering a meme fest. And just to be clear, this could be the start of a regional war, but a world war is not on the cards.
Firstpost decodes the U.S. election, explains how America chooses its president, your primer on the race to the White House, everything you need to know about how America votes, and its global implications. U.S. Election Explained, every Monday and Thursday only on Firstpost.